Welcome to the Mint Special. I'm Andy Hodges, live from ZTN Studios in Harare, Zimbabwe. Our discussion this morning, and a very important discussion, International Day for the Eradication of Poverty 2021 commemoration. Building forward together, ending persistent poverty, respecting all people and our planet. This broadcast is brought to you by Zimbabwe's TV network ZTN and our partners, the Poverty Reduction Forum Trust, or PRFT. Now, should you have any comments or views on our program this morning, please feel free to pass your comments on our Facebook page, Zimbabwe's TV network, or via our Twitter handle @ZTN News. This morning, we commemorate the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty. Now, according to the World Bank report on projected poverty impacts of COVID-19, between 71 to 100 million people globally are being pushed into poverty as a result of the crisis, with the majority of the new extreme poor being found in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, where poverty rates are already high. In 2021, this number is expected to rise to between 143 and 163 million people around the world. In Zimbabwe, the World Bank's Economic and Social Update report estimates that the number of extreme poor is expected to remain at 7.9 million in 2021, amid continued elevated prices and a slow recovery of jobs and wages in the formal and informal sectors. On today's program, we will discuss the challenges towards eradicating poverty in Zimbabwe, identify short-term and potential long-term interventions that will help tackle poverty and inequalities now and beyond the COVID-19 pandemic, and hopefully educate the public on what exactly poverty is. We will further explore what type of resources are required to address poverty resources challenges in Zimbabwe. And finally, today, of course, we celebrate and reinforce the achievements of humanity. Joining me today on the Mint Special to discuss International Day for the Eradication of Poverty 2021 commemoration, Building Forward Together, Ending Persistent Poverty, Respecting All People and Our Planet. I am joined in the studio by Judith Cowlem, Executive Director from the Poverty Reduction Forum Trust, PRFT, Dr. Edmondson Tetwa, Chief Director, Social Development and Disability Affairs at Zimbabwe's Ministry of Public Service, Labour and Social Welfare, and finally Prosper Chitambara, Development Economist, Labour and Economic Development Research Institute of Zimbabwe, LEDRIS. That's Dr. Prosper Chitambara. Welcome to the Mint Special.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Judith, before I get into exactly what poverty is, because I think that is a critical question, what is exactly United Nations International Day for the Eradication of Poverty? And in your opinion, is it important in the Zimbabwean context? What exactly does it mean?
Thank you, Andy. The United Nations General Assembly declared the 17th of October as the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty, as a commemoration, as an awareness-raising initiative, as a reminder to the global world about the plight of people who are living in poverty globally. So this is just a day that puts us back on form to remind us what people are going through, what challenges are going through, and also as a way of renewal of commitment that would have been made by government and different partners in terms of responding to these challenges that are being faced by people who are living in poverty. But I may add, Andy, that while a day is designated to it, it shouldn't be an event, but an ongoing process where every day we are asking ourselves what our actions are doing in terms of either increasing or reducing poverty. So it's an ongoing thing. And you ask what it means for Zimbabwe and whether it's relevant. I think it's quite important and relevant, especially now. We have seen deepening levels of poverty, especially being compounded by the COVID-19 pandemic. And so what it means is more and more people are getting poorer. There is actually a new group of poor people who previously either were employed in formal sector, which is now
of course created by the lockdowns and so on.
Exactly. So it's important that we reflect on that and say we want to build forward. And as we build forward, we are building forward together. And I'm glad that the theme is talking about respecting all people, is talking about respecting our planet, because it's saying it can't be business as usual. And also that it's not one entity that can address it. In that regard, I would want to applaud the government's initiative towards taking a whole of government approach to its planning, which is good. But because government alone cannot do it, it means it needs the efforts of everyone. So we need to move towards a whole of society approach. And why this day is also important as a reminder is that, yes, we hear of the clarion call on leave no one behind, but it's almost becoming a buzzword. But what this commemoration is saying is we need to be transformative. So leaving no one behind is not just carrying everybody with us in their silent voices, but we need to be transformative. And what are we transforming? We are transforming systems, we are transforming institutions, we are transforming policies that have been a hindrance to achieving the poverty eradication. So really it's quite important, and we need to be doing that together with the people that are in poverty.
I think what I like there is that we can't be in silos. We've got to continuously remember the poor in our community and also do something about it. I think that's the critical part. Edmas, welcome to the Min Special. The theme for this year's International Day for the Eradication of Poverty 2021 commemoration is, of course, building forward together, ending persistent poverty, respecting all people and, of course, our planet. So your view, as I asked Judith, what does it mean to Zimbabwe? And, of course, in your opinion, how relevant is it to us?
Very important, very relevant indeed. Poverty is an abhorrible state of being, that everybody, must fight with renewed energy. And, it is in this context that we must ultimately embrace, the theme and walk the talk.
I mean, it's interesting because, as Judith said, I think COVID-19 really emphasized, I can put more people, as you said, into poverty. And of course, your ministry is at the forefront of that. You must have seen the numbers of poor prior to COVID-19 and obviously due to the pandemic and the lockdowns, Edmas.
Yes, true. Zimbabwe, is part of the global village, has had its own share of increased levels of poverty, largely on account of, the COVID-19, pandemic, together with, it's the containment measures, associated with it, wherein, the formal labor market was drastically affected. And even those men and women, boys and girls that were, are into the informal sector were also negatively, affected. And because of that, the levels of poverty then ultimately, increased.
Yeah.
Good.
Thank you, Edmas. Judith, before I bring in Prosper, I mean, in my opening, you heard the numbers. I mean, the numbers of extreme poor in Zimbabwe is expected to remain at 7.9 million in 2021, and that's, of course, according to the World Bank. But I suppose the core question is, what exactly is poverty? How is it defined, and how is it, in your opinion, manifesting itself in Zimbabwe?
Thank you, Andy. Really, when we talk about poverty, we are talking about the life that we live. There could be book definitions of poverty, but I'm not interested in the book definitions. It's about a life that is devoid of decency, that is devoid of dignity. So those deprivations that make somebody unable to live a dignified way of life.
Is it like not being able to afford food? Or
exactly. So poverty, Andy, is hunger. We have people in Zimbabwe now who cannot afford the standard 3 meals a day, let alone the nutritional value of whatever meal that they are going to get. That's poverty. Poverty is lack of access to decent accommodation, crowding, which even was made worse during COVID when we were trying to enforce the regulations of distancing. And when people are crammed in one room, you find that right now the country is grappling with the challenge of drug abuse by youths, of promiscuity. Part of it, in my view, is because some of those youths cannot be in the same room with their parents at certain times. So they are forced to be outside. And when they are outside, they then engage in these destructive behaviors. So poverty is lack of decent accommodation. Poverty is lack of a decent employment. I'm sure you have heard on the streets, Zimbabweans have coined this this lingo, kungwava ngwava. And really, it's dehumanizing.
Yeah.
It's dehumanizing. It means there are no decent jobs for people, which will then enable them to have the disposable income to be able to afford the basic commodities for their day-to-day life, so that they live a life of dignity. And also really poverty is about even lack of voice. When the democratic governance does not give room for people to participate and influence the processes, the development trajectories, the activities that happen, that impact on their lives, that's another indicator. And when we look at most of those things, it's also the widening inequalities that we see. So as we talk
it's like
about
a wealth gap, if I can call it.
It's not just wealth, even social, and because
okay.
we are saying the indicators are both economic and they are also social. So you find that some of the inequalities are on geographic grounds, where you have the rural urban. So even as we talk about access to decent housing, access to infrastructure, access to health, you find that mostly people in the rural areas are more left behind as we talk about leaving no one behind and building forward together. You find that there are inequalities even within and among social groups, either by ethnicity, by tribe. You find that there are inequalities with regards to age. So poverty is manifesting itself in the widening gap that we see in those inequalities that people experience. So for me, really, poverty is about the deprivations in those key elements of one's life, which will end up with them not living a dignified life. We can be proud and say we have access to education for most of our children, but we know now that that's not enough. So if we churn out thousands and thousands of graduates and then we end up on the street doing menial jobs, we haven't addressed
but even
poverty.
before we get there, I mean, the fact is that people cannot even afford to pay the little bit to send their children to school, to buy books, to buy uniforms. I mean, and those children
so
don't go to school.
It's about access, it's about affordability, it's also about quality. So when somebody fails to access health care, and if it's there when they fail to afford it, that's a manifestation of poverty. And another area and which I think is important is about lack of access to quality water and sanitation. Generally the urban areas have to be characterized in that sector by piped water, where you open your tap and get water. But right now, most of our urban areas, we are talking of sinking boreholes. And to me, that's ruralizing the urban area. We should be talking of sinking boreholes in the rural areas for people then to afford to have water near to them. But we see that there are now long queues of people at communal water sources in the urban areas. And the challenges that come with that. We see the face of the woman in those queues and the kind of impacts that come through just being exposed to that situation. It exacerbates poverty, and in an unequal way, because women then are impacted more than the other groups.
And I suppose persons with disabilities as well will also suffer from that. I'm sure Edmos will talk about that when I come to him. Thank you, Judith. Prosper, I think Judith has given a very comprehensive view of what poverty is, and I'm sure you could fill us in on the numbers. I think that's also important. But what is your view, though, about the structural determinants to poverty eradication in Zimbabwe? Because, you know, it appears from what Judith is saying, this is a holistic problem. It isn't about having, maybe not, sure, not having a job could be one element of it, but she brought in sanitation, access to health, access to proper education, jobs, you know, so it suddenly becomes a much bigger issue. I mean, really, how is it easy or hard to eradicate poverty, in your opinion?
No, I think it's like we say, poverty is multidimensional, and obviously it requires a holistic and comprehensive approach to address it. But we've seen in a number of countries that it's actually possible to, maybe not to eradicate, but to reduce the number of citizens, of people that are living, especially in extreme poverty. So in terms of the structural determinants, let me look at three. The first one is economic growth. And not just economic growth, we need to ensure there is rapid, inclusive and sustained growth. I think that's very, very important.
Oh, I mean, that's when why though? So jobs and so forth. Is this
and I'll come to that again.
Okay.
So when the economy is growing, number one, it increases the fiscal space and the capacity of government to invest in social services. When the economy is growing, it means there's an expansion of incomes among the different economic agents. So that's very important. And we see it in China, for example. China, ever since 78, when they started their development success story, their economy has been growing on average by around 8% every year, consistently. And as a result of that consistency in growth, they've actually reduced the number of Chinese living in poverty by almost 800 million. And those are huge numbers. So we need rapid, inclusive, and sustained growth to attack poverty. Number two, access to productive assets. I think that's very, very important. And we see that again in Asia, most Asian economies. As long as people don't have access to productive assets, then they are more likely to fall into poverty. And which are these productive assets? Land, for example. Land is very key. And when you look at Japan and China, when they started their development stories, they started off by redistributing land. And not just redistributing land, but also enhancing the capacity of the farmers, especially the smallholder farmers. So that's very critical. Then number two, the issue of jobs. And again, that's related to the rapid and sustained growth. But what we've seen in most African economies is that, yes, economies have been growing. There's a recent paper that was done by the World Bank that actually analyzed growth and employment, the relationship between growth and employment in Africa. And they actually showed that between 1990 and around 2016, on average, the average African economy grew by around 5–6%, while the number of poor Africans actually also rose by 50 million. So it actually is an indictment on the quality of the growth that's being generated by most African economies.
There is growth, but it's in the wrong areas, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. It's growth that is mainly being driven by the extractives. And the extractives, by their nature, they are highly capital intensive, so they don't create employment opportunities. They're also associated with illicit financial flows. So I think the sustainability of the growth becomes very, very critical. So those three factors, in my view, are the key.
I can see what you mean by holistic. There's no doubt about it. Edmos, I want to bring you in.
And of course, access to social services.
I won't go into that. Well, now we have Edmos here to talk about the social services side. But Edmos, you've heard both Judith, her definition or explanation of what poverty is, and of course, Prosper putting it into an economic perspective. But what about your comment and views of your ministry on the structural determinants to poverty eradication in Zimbabwe? Are there challenges or hindrances?
Well, maybe just to say the structural determinants of poverty will then come to or amount to the fact that government has got primary responsibility to make sure that its people or all citizens are cushioned from the vagaries of poverty. And to that effect, all determinants that Chitambara put across will come to rest on the lap, of government. The prime responsibility and the prime, primary, wish of everybody is that their welfare must be looked after. Whether you are at work, you are at home, wherever you are, your welfare must be looked after, and that's the ultimate responsibility of government. Of course, with a number of development partners, because we can't, as government alone, fight and win the war against poverty. So in a way, the structural poverty, as I prefer to call it, has been exacerbated, like we said before, by the advent of COVID-19 together with associated containment measures, and the demand on social services has also tended to increase, and at the same time, the COVID-19 has also put a strain on the available fiscal space. That has shrunk in a way because of the economy, and but we have tried under the circumstances to ameliorate the lives and livelihoods of our ultra poor in this country through a number of remedies.
I want to ask you a direct question, because obviously poverty existed before COVID-19.
Thank you.
And I think when COVID-19 came in, I think Judith explained this, it exacerbated the problem. In fact, it created more poor. Do you think that it caught your ministry a bit by surprise? Do you think that the COVID-19 exposed your ministry to the fact that maybe you weren't doing enough to eradicate poverty? What would be your view of that comment?
Not as such. Poverty, COVID-19 was one of the many calamities that used to befall us. I think you remember we even had cyclones. Of course, the COVID was slightly higher in terms of proportion, but as a government, we already had a number of poverty reduction programs that we simply were able to lean on when that disaster struck, and those were associated with our cash transfers, our public assistance.
Well, don't worry, we'll get into some of the programs that you do, that the government does later. But I think it's an interesting concept, of course, that sometimes you need a disaster to really highlight some of the issues.
Yeah,
that,
to catalyze.
To actually see that, wow, we're not doing enough in those areas, even though, of course, COVID-19 is terrible and it still remains terrible. You're watching the Men's Special. Our discussion this morning, International Day for the Eradication of Poverty 2021, commemoration. Building forward together, ending persistent poverty, respecting all people and our planet. This broadcast is brought to you by Zimpaper's TV network ZTN and our partners, the Poverty Reduction Forum Trust, PRFT. Judith, I want to talk about the Poverty Reduction Forum Trust, PRFT. I mean, you have numerous goals and objectives. Maybe you could briefly explain what these are, but also explain what role do you believe civil society organizations, CSOs like yourselves, play towards the eradication of poverty in Zimbabwe?
Thank you very much, Andy. So as an organization, really our mandate is, our mission, vision is to see a Zimbabwe free from poverty. And we do that through advocating for policies that are pro-poor, because we believe even if somebody is implementing a program on the ground, the environment has to be conducive. And that is mostly determined by the policy. So our work is around pushing for policies that put people at the center of development. And we know that it's not a quick win when you are working with policy, and it's also even not a quick win when you want to influence change. And a lot of players do come into play. So civil society organizations come in to complement what government is doing in several ways. first of all, we are saying for development to be effective and to be sustainable, it has to address the needs of the people. And those needs you can only know when you engage with the people. So civil society act as an agent to create space, to get voice of the ordinary citizens, to then influence the development trajectory. So that's one role that civil society plays. And because civil society is across sectors, we have organizations that are into service delivery as a way of complementing government. We have organizations that are into research, like ourselves, like LEDRIS and many others. So they do come in to then complement. So that's an important role. And so service delivery, again, is a direct contribution, where we are saying government does not necessarily have all the resources or skills or financial or human. So civil society comes in to then fill in that gap. So it complements what government is doing in that regard. And for any program then to target correctly, there is need for the correct information. So civil society contributes in terms of data generation. And most of it is also qualitative. You will hear figures and numbers, maybe from Zimstats. But beyond those figures and numbers, there are people, there are faces. So civil society helps to bring the qualitative or the story or the faces to those numbers. So, yeah.
You mentioned that you advocate for propoor policies by policymakers. But I suppose the question then is, and you did say it takes some time, how effective have you actually been in achieving this? And furthermore, in your opinion, how important is it to have what we would call political will, especially in terms of policy formulation?
And it's unfortunate that as we are sitting here, we are talking of increasing numbers in poverty. So in a way, I guess it's an indicator that we have failed. We haven't been able to influence that much because the numbers are increasing. Our aim is to ensure that those numbers decrease, that policies respond.
It just means you have more work to do, I think.
Exactly. It
not that
does.
you're failing, but you have more work to do.
It does. But I guess it's linked to the second part of your question in terms of political willingness. What a civil society has always put pressure on government and demanded is that realistically, as a country, we do have resources, natural resources, that in our view, we think if there is political willingness to really capitalize on those resources in a manner that is distributive, it would be able to meet the needs of the people. So that's lack of political willingness in our view. And also we could even use the Auditor General's report, where we know about 435 recommendations were put across government ministries and departments. But out of those 435, I think only about 109 have been implemented. Why? What is the resistance about? So for me, that's an indication of an unwillingness to respond, because what those recommendations are aiming for are for effective utilization of national resources, which would then benefit the people, which would then be directed towards the needs of the people. So the lack of political willingness for me is also exhibited in that kind of behavior.
Edmos, I will bring you in just now, but Prosper, I think let me jump to you, because there's quite an interesting thought there that Judith brings out. I mean, she's saying that Zimbabwe does have enough natural resources. If we funneled it towards pro-poor policies, of course, we could start eliminating or reducing poverty. However, in your opening statements, this balance between putting resources into growing the economy, putting resources into job creation, but also trying to find money to put it into, in Edmos's ministry there, into social protection services. It's difficult. I mean, let's not say this is easy, is it?
No, it's not easy. It's difficult. But I think the important point to highlight, like Judith has highlighted, is the fact that we have the resources to be actually dealing with poverty. So in development economics, we always talk about the development paradox of poverty in the midst of plenty. So our biggest problem, not just in Zimbabwe, but in most low-income countries, has been stewardship and management of our resources to bring to bear to issues of poverty reduction.
I mean, something that springs to mind, of course, is the 1.2 billion we lose every year through gold smuggling. I mean, can you imagine what that would do in terms of
so ultimately, when you talk about willingness and will, it's really where you are spending, what you are spending your resources on.
I'm with you. Now, I want to bring something in. Sorry, Edmos, I will come to you, but I want to bring something in because numbers suggest, of course, that a large percentage of our population is either makes its money or is in the informal sector. Your views, what is Zimbabwe doing, do you believe, very briefly, to ensure that the country builds sustainable livelihoods that reduces poverty? I think that's critical. That's a critical element.
I think the government has obviously a number of programs, BEAM, for example, which is trying to assist the indigent children, the harmonized social cash transfer, and other social protection mechanisms. Of course, there are maybe some can argue that they are probably not well coordinated. And also, a major challenge has been to do with sustainability, because some of these social protection mechanisms are being funded through donors, even in terms of access to social services like public health. I think donor funding is predominant, and I think we need to really win ourselves from that. And
start paying our way. So
exactly. I think that's very important. So yes, something is happening, but I think that we need to upscale that. It's not enough. Yeah.
Right. Edmos, I left you till now because I wanted you to hear what Judith and Dr. Chitambara was saying there. I really have a two-part question for you. You know, Judith, we talked about political will. So I suppose, you know, in your opinion, do you think the government has political will to put pro-poor policies in? And also, can you point out any of the policies, the pro-poor policies that the government has implemented in terms of the current support for people living in poverty and the measures in place to ensure that people living in poverty have access to social protection services, which of course falls directly under your ministry?
Thank you very much. I think the dichotomy between government and civil society will always stand, and for me it's very healthy, because it is, you know, the work of civil society organizations that, you know, drives, that pushes, you know, government to adopt certain policy, you know, measures. The issue of political will, it is there, in my view. At the same time, without you know, dismissing the fact that what civil society is doing is simply to urge us as government to do more. In this regard, the government has really taken, you know, quite a stance on poverty reduction, with a plethora of you know, policies and programs, you know, directed towards poverty, you know, reduction. Chief among them, you know, I think people have made allusions to the informal sector, and a lot of probably two issues. The youth, for example, have benefited or are benefiting through a number of, you know, financial programs, like you have the Empower Bank, you know, among others. The same applies to women who usually, you know, populate the informal sector. They now also have, you know, a women's bank. As a ministry, we, under our National Social Protection Framework, we also have a sustainable livelihoods pillar, which pillar speaks into, you know, the fact that poverty could be reduced by allowing people, by enabling people of all categories to fend for themselves. With the government
giving them the right tools to do that. I think that's also
yes, and the tools are there. The debate probably could be the efficacy, you know, of those tools, because I think, of course, ultimately, like I said before, as government, we strive, you know, for continuous improvement, and we are always in no way, you know, impervious, to new ideas. That
so
obviously
Edmond, sorry to jump in there, but I have an interesting thought, because I know government has put in place, Judith complimented the government earlier about some of the efforts you're doing. Prosper mentioned BEAM, mentioned the cash payouts. You also mentioned social protection policies that have been put in place. But the numbers are not going down, Edmond. Your views?
The numbers are going down because the face of poverty continues to change.
Okay.
That's the one issue. Two, I think we are also part of the global village. We are also at the receiving end of the adverse effects of climate change, for example. We are also at the receiving end of the adverse effects of COVID-19. We are also at the receiving end of constrained economic performance because of, a number of factors.
Okay. I think what I'm hearing from all of us is we should be doing things better, or at least learning from what we're doing and improving on them going forward. I think that's the critical part. You're watching the Mint Special. Today's discussion, International Day for the Eradication of Poverty 2021 commemoration. Building forward together. Ending persistent poverty, respecting all people and our planet. This broadcast is brought to you by Zimbabwe's TV network ZTN and our partners, the Poverty Reduction Forum Trust, PRFT. Prosper, we come to the part I always like about recommendations. Briefly, what poverty eradication strategies and policies would you recommend to be pursued by Zimbabwe's policymakers and indeed the government?
I think some of the points I've already mentioned, like ensuring that at least the economy is growing rapidly, it's growing sustainably, but also ensuring that we target and focus on sectors that are productivity enhancing and welfare increasing.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, because I appreciate the holistic viewpoint of it. Of course, if we build the economy, obviously that should eradicate poverty. But right now, as Judith has pointed out, people are poor. They don't have access to decent water and sanitation. They have no access. Well, they can't afford access to healthcare and maybe education as well. Yet critics have complained that the social payouts are minuscule and don't really meet.
They're minuscule, yeah. And social protection becomes critical as a way of mitigating poverty. It's been demonstrated the world over that when you have a well-funded and a well-coordinated, a well-oiled social protection mechanism, that can go a long way in mitigating poverty. But also when you look at, we have a huge deficit, a huge gap in terms of financing for critical sectors that can mitigate poverty. Judith mentioned water and sanitation is very, very critical. But when you look at the numbers in terms of how much investments we need in water and sanitation, we are looking at not less than 2 billion.
And let's not even talk about health, education.
For the next 5 years.
I mean, the number was
when you look at health,
34 billion over 10 years for infrastructure.
Oh, exactly. When you look at health, there is also a huge deficit that's there. So I think the challenge also is how best can we come up with innovative ways and means of enhancing fiscal space using our own domestic resources.
What strikes me, of course, is that we talk health. I mean, you first of all have to afford to pay to get into the hospital.
Oh, yeah.
Then you have to be able to afford to buy the drugs and medicines. I mean, it's not cheap. And
it's not cheap,
of course, people in the extreme poor just don't have the money.
Yeah, and when you look at the health financing, we've relied, I think, overly on the donors. I think about more than 50% of our health budget is funded from donors. And as you know, the health fund is coming to an end of this year. So I think that could leave us in a very invidious situation in terms of health financing, especially next year.
Julius, I want to bring you in there. Your view, what are the exact challenges towards eradicating poverty in Zimbabwe? And can you identify and recommend short-term and potential long-term interventions that will help tackle poverty and inequalities now? Of course, I talk about now and also beyond COVID-19 pandemic, which hopefully will be soon, but I doubt it. But anyway, you know.
Thanks, Andy. But I think the starting point is for us to really acknowledge and realize that addressing poverty should not be a charity issue, right? So it means we have to start by putting people at the center. Whatever it is that we are planning to do, we are putting the people who are going to be affected at the center. We talked earlier on about siloed, and I'm glad that Edmond I can't remember what I wanted to refer to, to what he mentioned. But I'm talking about
making them stand up for themselves, fend for themselves.
Exactly,
Yes,
it's about the empowerment.
Yes.
So we are talking about people being resilient, right, by themselves, so that they are not a charity case. We can't have people waiting every rain season for the presidential input scheme for them to start their farming activities. And yet we know, Prosper, like I was saying, the smallholder farmers are really key in terms of ensuring that there's that eradication of poverty. So really making sure that people are resilient. I want to point to an example.
That's an interesting point, because overseas in Europe and so forth, you have they have the dole system where they pay social protection in a way, and you just find people perpetually on the dole. They don't look for work, they don't do anything.
It's a moral hazard.
Because it's a moral hazard. So
exactly.
I get your point completely.
So exactly. So I was really impressed. Recently, there was highlight on the fruit and vegetable canning plant in Mutoko.
Yes, the president opened it recently.
And for me,
yes.
that's the way to go. Because one, it's not being done in the urban center. It's being done out where the people are. So you find that the rural communities, as they are living through growing potatoes, all the vegetables, there's been so much harvest loss. But with such kind of an initiative, then you find that there's so much that can be ripped out of that. So we would want a replication of that. Nice. And I'm also happy about the decentralization that the government is doing. What is it called? The devolution agenda, exactly. The devolution agenda, if we can maximize on it, because then it develops from below, from where the people are. So we need those programs that can be done, that then one, it will help in so many ways in decongesting the urban areas. Because if people can get jobs in the growth points that we tried to build years ago, let's go back to that. If then we can develop those centers, then people can get jobs nearer to them. So
it's a combination of sort of cash support, but as well putting in programs to empower people to be able to stand on their own feet.
Yeah, and I also wanted to speak to what this theme is talking about, moving forward together, and the integration that needs to happen so that we don't take a siloed approach. For example, government has initiatives to improve people's housing. But if they are going to locate people in wetlands, right, then it has implications for the environment and our planet. So we need to have programs that are integrated in a manner that gives a holistic kind of benefit to the people. I'll also speak even to the social protection initiative that the ministry has done, which we applaud. Besides it being very little, but there was no thought in terms of people are receiving the money through EcoCash. How many people have phones, right? So you want to link the social protection with the Ministry of ICT and all that together, so that we address it. Because if you are going to give money and then it goes probably somebody who has the phone but is irresponsible, I don't want to mention that is the man, but it is.
It's normally the men.
Exactly. And it exacerbates, we are talking about gender-based violence and all that. From a small
and they don't give the money to the ladies.
Exactly. From a small intervention, which we did in a very siloed approach, did not take a holistic, it can have ripple effects. So I think moving forward, as we are building forward, we need to be doing things differently in a manner that touches on all the facets of our people's lives.
Edmos, you heard Judith there as a way forward, building better, doing things differently so that it touches everybody. So let me ask you directly, what are your ministries and the Zimbabwean government's plans and strategies for building sustainable livelihoods towards improving the socio-economic conditions of people living in poverty now, of course, and post-COVID-19?
Thank you very much. Like I said, we always, seek to continuously improve, on our programming. And there are a number of initiatives that are meant to, make sure that our people graduate from perpetual, poverty and squalor. And those initiatives, like, in the rural areas in particular, revolve around making sure that the agricultural, programs perform, very well. For our vulnerable poor, there is a presidential, input scheme facility.
So Edmonds, are you saying that if people can be food sufficient, that also can go some way to helping eradicate poverty?
In a big way, because if you are food sufficient, it also means that the little resources that you get, are committed elsewhere.
Okay, I'm with you.
Yeah.
All right. So government does have, and I suppose through your ministry does have concrete plans to try and reduce that number, because remember the number is huge.
Yes.
7.9 million people.
Yeah.
It's a lot of people.
We do have quite a number. Like I said, poverty is the, spatially, let me say, contextualized. And even when you craft measures to deal with it, you need to be, alert to those fundamentals.
Okay.
The way you deal with urban poverty is very different from the way you deal with rural poverty. And like I said, I talked about the empower banks, the women's banks, and related issues that assist largely the informal sector, usually domiciled in urban areas. You also have some the agro-based programs associated with largely our rural folk. At the same time, not forgetting to make sure that education plays a very important role in building resilience.
But Edmonds, I would assume, and I'm sorry to go, I will, because we have to round up, but I would also assume that your ministry has to become more efficient, find in terms of distributing some of your social protection services. It also needs to create a proper database, get to the right people countrywide. I mean, commentators and critics say that you haven't really quite achieved that yet. What would you say to that?
Thank you. We're more or less achieving it. I think as we speak right now, we're in the process of coming up with an integrated social protection, MIS, Management Information System, which system is going to make sure that the coordination, and even to a greater extent, I'm saying to a greater extent, access, to all social protection programs, is automated.
Nice.
That's one. Then, of course, not forgetting what my colleague has, hinted on regarding connectivity, availability of gadgets to the most poor. Because, by the way, poverty is a virus. That cripples a person's ability to deal with it. There are issues of connectivity, the issue of availability of gadgets. Our ministry is seized with the process, of ensuring that its district structures, are complete, so that we are able to reach out to those people that have got those difficulties.
I also, very, very briefly, because we are running out of time, as I said, you're obviously the Chief Director, Social Development and Disability Affairs. So I don't want to leave out persons with disabilities, because that's also a critical component. I understand about 10% of our population are persons with disabilities. So are they catered for in terms of some of your programs that you're putting in? Because they can be most affected and can be very poor in our communities.
Thank you. They are very catered for, very much catered for. I think for planning purposes, we have a national disability policy that was launched in June this year, which policy speaks to the number of persons with disabilities, around 15%.
15%.
Yes, and also it is important to note that we have also realized over time that a number of persons with disabilities, maybe 2/3, can be helped to fend for themselves.
If they're given the right tools
if
and
they
support.
are given the right tools, and government is having quite a number of programs, chief among them the Disability Revolving Fund.
Right.
Yes, which fund is meant to give persons with disabilities, some income-generating projects. Okay. Where they come and take
again, giving them the ability to stand on their own feet.
To stand on their own feet.
Unfortunately, I have to jump in there. Judith, I'm going to give you just a few seconds because we have come to the end of the show. But maybe just, a sum up. Of course, today, International Day for the Eradication of Poverty 2021 commemoration. As you said, building forward together. Maybe just 30 seconds just to sum up.
I think the most important thing, Andy, is that poverty anywhere is poverty everywhere. And the COVID pandemic has actually shown us that when we neglect a certain segment of our society, it will come to hound us and hound us more costly. So I think it is important that moving forward, as we are building, for Zimbabwe, we do have a fertile ground because we have the documents, the National Development Plan, the disability policy that Edmo is talking about. All those are important, but let's translate them into programs that then bring about the kind of difference that we want in the people's lives, so that at the end of the day we all live decent and dignified lives.
And also, as you said at the beginning, let's just not look at the 17th of October as the day to commemorate poverty reduction. Let's do it all year round, 365 days a year.
Exactly.
I think on that note, we have come to the end of the Mint Special this morning. You have been watching our discussion. International Day for the Eradication of Poverty 2021 commemoration. Building forward together, ending persistent poverty, respecting all people and our planet. I'd like to thank my guests this morning, Judith Cowlem, Executive Director, Poverty Reduction Forum Trust, PRFT, Dr. Edmos Mtetwa, Chief Director, Social Development and Disability Affairs at Zimbabwe's Ministry of Public Service, Labour and Social Welfare, and Dr. Prosper Chitambara, Development Economist, Labour and Economic Development Research Institute of Zimbabwe, LEDRIS. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for appearing on the Mint Special this morning. This broadcast was brought to you by Zimpaper's TV network ZTN and our partners, the Poverty Reduction Forum Trust, PRFT. A final comment. The World Social Summit identified poverty eradication as an ethical, social, political and economic imperative of mankind and called on all governments to address the root causes of poverty, provide for basic needs for all and ensure that the poor have access to productive resources, including credit, education and training. Poverty eradication must and should be mainstreamed into the national policies and actions of every country, Zimbabwe of course included. An integrated strategy between poverty eradication necessitates implementing policies geared to more equitable distribution of wealth and income and social protection coverage. Zimbabwe has an estimated population of around 14 million citizens. Of those, you've heard the numbers. According to the World Bank, 7.9 million of those 14 million citizens are expected to be classified extreme poor this year, 2021. That is over 50% of the Zimbabwean population. This is a serious challenge to Zimbabwe, and poverty eradication should be treated with the seriousness it deserves. Don't you think? I'm Andy Hodges. Goodbye, and please, you all be safe.